Hey, what's going on, you guys? My name is The Raptor, and back by popular demand, we are going to be reacting to more of my subscribers' favorite matchups. A quick reminder for how this works: right now I'm not taking these matchups from these videos' comment sections. Instead, I take them from my Who Would Win polls on my community tab. Each one is chosen by looking at what suggestion got the most likes on the previous poll, so it's pretty representative of what my viewers like overall. I recommend checking out the previous video where we did this because we'll be picking up right where we left off, and of course these are all just my opinions. Feel free to leave yours in the comments. So starting off this batch, we have Sans versus Ness, and I don't really dig this idea too much, to be honest. Granted, I do believe it was primarily upvoted in honor of MatPat's retirement at the time, and you know what? I respect that. And that's not to say that that's the only thing this matchup would have going for it. If you really like it, then that's cool, but personally, it never really felt like the true matchup for either of these guys. Obviously, Sans has the Judge, which we talked about in the last episode. Ness has a few opponents like Frisk and Raz, and whichever one you like the most, I do think a decent amount of them work better for Ness than Sans, to be honest. And this doesn't really seem like the closest fight in the world either. Usually that wouldn't be the biggest deal to me as long as the matchup had other things going for it, or if it wasn't too one-sided or anything like that. But again, in an instance like this where the alts might honestly be better in that regard, it's hard to find any really big selling point with this matchup specifically. And I'm not an expert on either side here, like Undertale or Mother, Earthbound, etc., but it does really feel like this would be a Deku versus Asta or Korra versus Storm situation, in that if Death Battle were to announce this episode, I feel like a lot of people would be like, really? Wait, like that's the matchup you chose for them? Okay, just based on what else they have available to them in terms of opponents and all that. So this matchup definitely has its merits. I think the fight itself would be really fun, but I can't say that I've ever actively been wanting this episode, and I don't know if I ever will, to be honest. Next up, we got Joker versus Giorno, a matchup I have spoken about a little bit before, but I still have a lot to say about. Now, I am not that worried about the toxicity that would come with this episode happening personally. We've already gotten so much toxicity without the episode happening that at this point I have just become numb to it, and I don't think the toxicity from the community should stop Death Battle from making what they want to make anyway, and usually it doesn't seem to, and I am happy about that. And yeah, production value wise, I think this is a very intriguing idea. I think it could be super stylized with a lot of personality. It would have its own identity, and some of the best episodes are the ones that have a very standout identity. However, I do want to say that the debate itself kind of annoys me. Not the fact that there is one, that there is a hard debate that gets people talking, God knows we need more of those. It's the questions you have to answer in order to solve the debate. Because on the one hand, I like the idea of stats not always being the be-all end-all of the outcome. I like the idea that hacks might be able to overcome stats if they're just good enough, like hacks, abilities, etc. However, when you have a stat gap that is as big as the one in this debate, and there is still some debate over whether or not the hacks can overcome them, then at this point I just have to question the Haxie character. Who can't they beat? What can't they overcome if the debate is still there with a stat gap this wide? Like, does the opponent have to have the same hacks that they do? Like, maybe that works in their own world, but in a versus debate setting, that becomes really boring to me. And I am not trying to take sides here. I'm not trying to say that the Haxie character would win over the stat character or vice versa or anything. It's just a personal complaint of mine about the debate itself. And let's be honest, it's not like anyone's gonna go into the debate with an open mind, so, you know, what's really the point? But, you know, I still think this could be a really great episode production value-wise. I am not going to deny that. On a very different note, we move on to Henry Stickmin versus The Second Coming. Something I know some of the members of my Discord are quite into, and honestly, I can fully see why. This is one of those episodes where you know the show could really flex its animation muscles. There is so much creativity to inject in the content of the fight, like what happens, the attacks, etc., but also the overall look of the fight and the style. There is the opportunity to make this such a unique episode in the best way way possible. And I know that a big alt for this fight is like a battle royale between multiple stick animation characters, which I could get behind, although personally I much prefer battle royales when it really only makes sense to do the battle royale, and it doesn't make sense to distill it down to like a 1v1 between two of the characters. But I think this matchup does work incredibly well as a 1v1, so I kind of just prefer that one. You know, it's a lot less complicated in terms of the debate, and from a production perspective, it would definitely be less complicated there too, so, you know, I think that's worth bringing up. But yeah, I don't know that much about these series overall, or even the full extent of the connections most likely, and I don't even care. I just want to see how Death Battle would do it, how they would analyze it. I get major Sackboy versus Maxwell vibes from this idea, and even though I much prefer that idea, I would be super down for this one too. You know, the fact that these characters aren't known by everybody could bring it down on the priority list, but even still, as just a hypothetical idea, I think it would be so much fun. Naturally, after that, we get to sausage versus pepperoni, because obviously you guys would vote for that, so I'm gonna talk about which one I like more. You all asked for this. So in terms of their base forms, I would definitely pick sausage. I would much rather have that on its own than a stick of pepperoni. I don't think I've ever had an actual stick of pepperoni once in my life, whereas I have had a number of sausages for breakfast, and if we're including hot dogs in this, well then yeah, forget about it. However, in terms of most variations, I would probably go with pepperoni. Like, for example, I really like sausage casserole. That's one of my favorite dinners, but pepperoni pizza is one of my favorite foods of all time. Not to mention, I'm also not that big on breakfast foods in general. I have not had sausages that much, although still more than just a stick of pepperoni on its own, like I mentioned before. If you want me to talk about this in terms of a fight in any way, agility and maneuverability wise, they would probably be similar. Durability would probably depend on how they're cooked. I really don't know what else to say. I don't know how else to do this. This is not one of my favorite food fights that exist, personally, but I do respect the comparison, and now you know how I feel, I guess. Speaking of eating, the next one is Ken Konecki versus Eren Yeager. And if you've watched this channel before, you may know this is one of my favorite matchups right now, probably around my top 5 after Stitch versus Rocket and Galactus versus Unicron happened. I understand why some people might prefer other opponents for these two. Eren in particular, I know, has a number of them that some people may want more, but this personally just feels so perfect to me, and I'd be disappointed if we got something else instead. I really cannot lie. And I am kind of biased here because I did recently watch Attack on Titan with my dad for the first time, and that was such a great experience. I loved doing that, but I did like this matchup even before then. I just like it even more now, even if I do want to smack Eren in his fucking mouth so many times, but I still just really love this concept. There's a super cool spectacle that could come out of it, and also escalation without the characters being ridiculously overpowered, which is honestly pretty rare. I think the emotion could be great if done properly, and these are just two awesome series to learn about and analyze. Like, you know, that has nothing to do with the comparison, but it is still a big selling point, at least for me. I think it would be awesome. Now, I've talked about this a few times already, so I don't want to drag on too long, but I love so much about this idea. It is my favorite anime versus anime matchup right now. It would be something that's so different, but also so cool in its own way. I will defend it until I die. Moving on, Springtrap versus Junko Enoshima, the least polarizing matchup I've ever heard of. I'm sure there will be no issues in the comments whatsoever. Nah, but for real, it doesn't really surprise me that there are so many disagreements surrounding this idea, to be honest. Springtrap in particular seems like a character where everyone and their mother has a solid preferred fight for him. Whether that be Springtrap versus Chucky, even though I'm personally more partial to Chucky versus Slappy, or Springtrap versus Dio, even though I think Dio got the episode that he really needed, but I digress. I understand where the disagreements are coming from. However, it also kind of frustrates me because I've seen a lot of people call this matchup bad just because they have a different preferred for one of the characters, or because Danganronpa sucks lol, and I'm like, come on guys, you know that these attributes don't make matchup ideas bad on their own. Like, you can have your own personal biases all you want, but you can't pretend that that translates to objective opinions or anything. anything, and it frustrates me how often I see stuff like that. In a vacuum, I don't see much that is super offensive about this idea. I wouldn't defend it like my life depended on it or anything, but it could definitely have an interesting dynamic and overall script. I'm not going to deny that. And yes, you could make the argument that you could say that about a lot of matchups, but that's kind of the point that I'm trying to make. I don't know much about the debate itself or the series, so I won't give a stronger opinion than that. It just seems like a matchup that's perfectly fine to exist. I am sorry if that sentence upsets you. I hope you can feel better. Next up, we had Rick Sanchez versus Bender Rodriguez from Futurama, one of the main opponents I've heard thrown around for Rick, even though there seems to be a ton of them. I really liked Rick versus the Doctor as an episode, and I think the matchup is pretty cool too, but you don't have to do that much digging to find out one of the combatants is really just a better version of the other as far as accomplishments go and technology and combat, etc, etc. You could argue that Rick versus Bender is a more interesting debate, at least by comparison. You know, it doesn't fall flat as much. I could see some people arguing that, and it definitely has enough entertainment value given what these guys bring to the table. They bring so much, Jesus Christ. I definitely think that we could use more adult cartoons in the mix. I am very happy that Death Battle has been using more cartoons in general, but I think stuff like Adult Swim we could also prioritize a little more if possible. I am obviously more partial to Homer versus Peter, but I think this is a viable option combat-wise, and it's a very easy idea to come up with if you're trying to stay in that realm. I'm sure that some of Rick's alts are better in some ways, and I can't imagine any of them are that high on the list now that Rick versus the Doctor has come out, but I think this fight works just fine. And last up is Ego versus Mogo, ending with a good old Marvel versus DC matchup once again, although this time taking things a bit more seriously. This one is so fun to me because obviously Marvel and DC copy each other all the time, and this leads to Marvel versus DC copycat matchups. This is usually done with their more popular characters like Aquaman versus Namor, Ant-Man versus Atom, or Green Arrow versus Hawkeye, etc. And Marvel and DC do this with their more minor characters as well sometimes, but because the characters are so minor, the matchups would not be as widely spread. However, with Ego and Mogo, despite them being such minor characters, their connections are so specific and so random and outlandish that this matchup basically had to catch on, and I am so here for it. As someone who loves Marvel and DC, I am so happy that this kind of thing happened at least once. And at least on the surface level, I think that there is an actual debate to be had. We have a very, very powerful Green Lantern versus a being that's been on par with Galactus and other similar characters before, and that sounds really fun to me. Imagining the scope of the animation and the ridiculousness of the script is so fun, for better or for worse, because I'm not here to say that this would be the best episode ever or anything, but it would definitely have its own identity. It would be unique. And honestly, that's kind of necessary when it comes to some Marvel versus DC fights these days, because there's so many of them, at least in terms of Death Battle, but also in terms of matchup making in general. Yeah, there are a lot of them. It's not my favorite Marvel versus DC matchup ever. That would probably be Deathstroke versus Taskmaster, at least in terms of the ones that Death Battle has not done yet. I also really like Vision versus Red Tornado and some others, but I still think this would be a lot of fun. And that is gonna wrap up today's video. Thank you for watching, and let me know your own opinions about any of this in the comments. I'll do this kind of thing from time to time as long as there's enough interest, and be sure to keep up with my community tab if you want to be a part of this selection process. I will see you in the next video. Have a great day, and peace out.